Welcome to the second keynote lecture of ECSC 21. I leave the floor to Professor Tvesky to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and welcome everyone. Barry Smith wants to put order in all of our lives, and it's magic how he does it. He's in a field called ontology, which to my psychological mind means categories and subcategories. And we all know when there's too much stuff around, we put it into categories, furniture and food, and then we put it into subcategories. And for those simple categories, the categories both are relatively easy to sort. It can be done on perceptual features, but they also have implications for our lives. They have functions. They tell us what to do, what we can do with those categories. So they have to be, on the one hand, discernible by a group, and on the other hand, useful and functional. And Barry has somehow use these sorts of principles to put order in many kinds of lives, from the geographic to the legal to the business. And again, to me, it's magic. And he's here to tell us how that works. So Barry, we're all eager ears.
Thank you, Barbara. So there will be some magic here. Not all of it coming from me. So this is the title. It's a very long title, which I gave to the organizers a long time ago, and I haven't managed to cover all of that ground. I'm starting from a paper I produced for a meeting on spatial cognition called On Drawing Lines on a Map, which is about this kind of problem. How is it that Sykes and Picot were able to bring into being two countries at a remote distance by drawing lines on a map like this? And the lines they drew are obviously still quite significant. So what does it mean to draw lines on a map in this way, in this successful way? And that's going to be the first part of this talk. And I will then move for a very brief discussion of cognitive spacemaking. And then I will try to draw some conclusions from the complexity of cognitive spacemaking for the possibility of a general AI dialogue machine. And I will say that it's impossible that we will ever have a general AI dialogue machine, just so that you know. All right, so I start with a little story. This is Niagara Falls in the winter. I live 20 minutes from here. And in the olden days, the area around Niagara Falls was private property, and people used to pay money in order to look at the falls through peepholes. And this was regarded for a long time by politicians in New York State as being somewhat unfortunate. And so the movement grew to create a state park. This is Niagara Falls from a distance. You were, in the olden days, allowed to look at the falls from a distance, but not close up. You couldn't see any of that, but you could hear it. Well, now you can see it. You can stand at the spot where the video was just taken, which is roughly the spot above the bottom left-hand corner here. So you see Goat Island, which splits the Niagara River into two. The Niagara River falls into Lake Erie over two falls, the Horseshoe Falls and the American Falls. And this is the statute in 1883, which created the Niagara Reservation, a state reservation to allow people to get very close to the falls and to prevent people from building too many buildings near the falls. Canada also has a state park, but there are more buildings on the Canadian side. And I'm just going to talk about the New York side. The state park is the green that you see here. Now, this was created as an area of space set aside legally before there were any fences, before there were any signs, before there were any of the equipment that you need to have a state reservation. So there are 4 stages which occurred here. First was deliberating and planning, then a legal declaration, and that created immediately a certain new entity, which I call a fiat spatial entity. And then there started physical transformations, building fences, gates, signs, and so on. And now all the activities appropriate to a park can take place inside the park. And so this is magic. You make a decision in Albany, and suddenly a new spatial object exists. And this it conforms to this the ideas of this man, John Searle, which is how just by speaking and by signing documents, we can bring new spatial entities as well as claims, rights, and so on into existence. So these are the steps, and at the bottom you can see that there are 3 stages of space making. First of all, you create the spatial entity, then you build the fences, and then you have a park. And the park still survives today. It will probably survive forever. But sometimes this doesn't work. Sometimes legal space making fails for one reason or another. Now here you see Grand Island. The Niagara River, you can see, is split by Grand Island into 2, and there's a small island called Navy Island. Navy Island was at one stage promoted as the headquarters of the United Nations, and Grand Island was going to become a world peace capital. That didn't work. Manhattan was more powerful than Western New York, and so the plans, really quite remarkable plans, you can see the falls rising all the time at the back here. These are the plans for the UN headquarters on Navy Island. And Grand Island then would be the world peace capital. Now, in 1845, there was an even more interesting plan to create a new fiat spatial entity by a man called Mordecai Noah, who wanted to create a refuge for the Jews in Grand Island. And you can see this plaque still. It was going to be called Ararat. And conveniently, Grand Island is 20% larger than Manhattan, so there would have been plenty of room to put Israel in a new country, or as a new country, between the USA and Canada. And there is even a beach. So this is Grand Island, New York beach. This is Tel Aviv, and we would have had Tel Aviv, New York. It would have been here that we had it. I'm here in New York now. But that didn't happen. And that's because the way in which we produce the magic of new property, new countries, new sites for buildings, just by signing declarations on a paper, requires that certain background conditions are satisfied. Basically, you have to have the legal right to sign the relevant piece of paper. And these conditions were satisfied by the New York Senate when it signed this decree, and that's why we have this park. But they were not satisfied by Mordecai. They were satisfied here in the end. This was a kind of retrospective declaration that they were satisfied. This is why we have a country. And they're always satisfied when real estate developers work out where they're going to build a new development by means of what they call a plat. All right, so 4 stages: ideas, creation of fiat entity, and then physical transformations, and then activities. We can all use it. And these failed in the case of Mordecai's efforts. So Mordecai did not get his homeland. And what I want to argue is that all of history is about what I'm going to call fiat spatio-temporal entities. So even though Mordecai did not get his homeland, he did for a time create Ararat, New York. It just didn't acquire any kind of long-standing existence. But there was a fiat spatiotemporal entity, in other words, a piece of the history of Grand Island, which Mordecai initiated. And that's what history is about. It's about all of those ways in which different people at different times, successfully or unsuccessfully, initiated histories of places. So this is performed sometimes by splitting or joining existing places. So once you have a fiat spatial order, in other words, things like country boundaries in existence, you can start splitting and joining. And that's what people do now to create things like the European Union and the Schengen and the Craiova Group and the Visegrad Group and the Weimar Triangle and so forth. These are all fiat spatial entities, each of which has a history, some of them quite long-lived histories, some of them rather short. All right, so this is what history is about. All the work of historians, crime reporters, courts, and so on involves fiat spatial entities, which are tunnels through the past. All of planning, whether it's political or whether it's your next holiday, involves creating fiat spatial temporal entities, which are tunnels through the future. You create them as fiat, they become actual physical spatiotemporal entities only if you actually take the holiday or if you go to Mars. All right, but now people can make fake fiat spatiotemporal entities. And that the Soviet Union tried to do this in the period between 1977 and 1980 when they decreed that Romania should remove all references to the fact that Moldavia used to be part of Romania. So in other words, they were trying to fake history by going back into the past and changing what actually happened. And that can be part of history too, because the beliefs exist and those beliefs are part of history. And similarly, people can fake stories about where they were in the past. That's how we get false alibis. All right, so space, originally people made space physically, just like every other organism makes its space physically. They find a plot of land or an area of land. We can't quite say plot yet. And they start to work out ways in which they can get food and protect themselves from predators and so forth. But the very first plotting of land almost certainly occurred in Egypt. So the very first fiat spatial entities were probably sacred land, which were plotted in the reign of Akhenaten, which was around the 1350 before the Common Era. And then we have evidence that surveying practices spread through Egypt from about that time. So this is where fiat spatial entities began. Now, the very earliest preserved architectural blueprint is a plan of St. Gall, which is a plan for an ideal monastery. This plan was realized only in very partial ways in real monasteries. This particular plan was never physically realized. But the plan is interesting. This is how it would have looked. The plan is interesting because it determines not just what should be built and where it should be built, but also what activities should be performed in those various parts of the fiat spatial entity, which when it became a physical spatial entity. Now, this is important. The fiat spatial entities are important only because they determine people's behavior. Sometimes behavior on the inside, for instance, the artisans working away in their workshops, sometimes behavior from the outside, for instance, politicians in Albany or in Washington determining what happens to Grand Island, New York. In both cases, they're dealing with fiat spatial entities and with the actual or possible physical entities which allow activities to take place inside them. So the Doomsday Book is an early example in in Europe of how land was divided or recognized as being divided into plots. And the king gets to have the largest plot, in effect, the whole of the country. He gives away parts of it to his knights and his barons, but he himself retains ultimate property rights over the whole of the kingdom. And of course, the king doesn't just own a fiat spatial entity. He owns the ground. He owns whatever is underneath the ground. He owns whatever is above the ground. And eventually, he comes to own also things like systems for bringing it about that there is water delivered to the parcels within the ground and to the houses within the ground, water and energy and police protection and all of the other things which make modern day real estate what it is. And when a real estate developer plots a set of houses on a plat, he is not only plotting a fiat spatial entity, he is also plotting all of the physical things that go hand in hand therewith, including tunnels and pipes and electric current transmission systems and police protection and shopping and so forth. So these are the layers of spacemaking. I'm not talking very much about the physical layers here. The information layers will become important when we start talking about how spacemaking impacts with both psychology and language. All right, so just one last piece of information about plots, that is to say, where you live. So you could say that you live in Manhattan, but that actually means two different things. It means, on the one hand, that you have a home address which is in the borough of Manhattan. But it can also mean that your home is a spatial niche in which you live, a niche which affords all the amenities of life. It gives you electricity, it gives you heat, and so forth. So these are two ways in which you can live in Manhattan. You can live in Manhattan, but in fact not be in Manhattan at the time when you are telling people that you live in Manhattan, because your home is in Manhattan. And a home is not a building. You can't live in a brick wall. You live in the niche which the brick walls in your home surround. And then you might say you live on Manhattan. I'm not sure if people do say that, but people say it about other islands. And what that means is that the building in which you live is on the island, which is a physical entity, which has a mass and can burn and so forth. So sense 1A is you live in one of the 5 boroughs. Sense 1B, which is more interesting, is that you live in a collection of interconnected open containers. The whole of Manhattan is a huge assemblage of interconnected open containers like that. Some of them open to the sky, some of them open to the ground, some of them open to their next door neighbor or to the neighbor in the next room. Okay, and then Manhattan Island is a physical whole which includes tunnels running through it, which are not parts of the island, they are gaps in the island. And all the buildings on top, which are physically attached to the island, and all the road surfaces which have been added to the island so that we can move around conveniently. All right. So I talked about layers of space making. So Manhattan is not just a place, it's a gigantic assemblage of layers like this. All right, now let's move beyond plots. Let's look at plats. Let's move beyond plats even. Let's look at psychology. This is very brief. So we have a visual system, and the visual system always sees an area of space. That area of space is called the visual field, but it's a very strange area of space. It doesn't have sharp boundaries. It's changing when we move or when the entities in our environment move. It forms a continuous fiat spatio-temporal entity, which is a kind of spatial complement to that fiat spatio-temporal entity, which is ourselves. or rather, which is the area occupied by ourselves as we move through space. And then we can see that people organize space when they are living together. Some of them organize space alone. Some of them organize space in smaller or larger groups. There's a long section in my paper about how space in a schoolyard is organized because some of the people in the schoolyard want to play football. Incidentally, this is a very interesting collection of space-making magic. The lines on the playground here create a special space where football can indeed be played. But all the people hanging around on those areas of the playground are, of course, getting in the way of anybody who would want to play football by using the lines. And then the border around the playground itself, it creates another fiat spatial entity which separates the playground from everything else. This is studied under the heading of proxemic zones. So different people relate to each other in different ways, and how they relate will determine which proxemic zone they allow each other to occupy. And this happens not just to children, it also happens to adults when they congregate in places like railway stations. All right, now let's move to linguistic spacemaking. So Len Talmy has had a lot of very interesting things to say about linguistic spacemaking, and much of what follows is indebted to him, although there isn't much to follow. Now, when you say here, then you are performing a fiat space-making act. You are changing the world by making a division between all of those things which are here and all of those things which are not here. And of course, when you do that, you will not quite know what those things are. And you may indeed, in the immediate next second, change your mind because you move or because the thing which is there becomes more salient. So that line between what is here and what is there is a very strange kind of line. The line exists and it's marked linguistically. And there are very many similar lines which are marked by other kinds of spatial deixis. Now, Talmy tells us not merely about how we define the world into here and there, he tells us how there is a spatial system of language which structures how we describe everything when we use language. Everything's spatial. I guess that means nearly everything. Not only for Talmy, everything which exists in physical space, which is what I'm primarily interested in, but also everything which exists in any kind of fictional space or in any kind of metaphoric space. When you say, for instance, that he surrounded her with his love, then you're using Talmy's spatial system of language, but you're describing something which is not spatial. The surrounding here is not a spatial surrounding, except metaphorically. So when we use Talmy's spatial system of language, basically we divide the here, whatever it is that is salient, into the figure, which is what we're primarily talking about, and then the ground, which is the background against which we pick out the figure. And we do this everywhere and for everything, from the tiniest insects to the whole of the universe, indeed. We always pick out a figure against a ground, practically speaking. This is the spatial system of language. It has many, many modules, many different variants to describe the different kinds of spatial disposition that we're interested in, spatial orientation, but this system is pretty much universal. Now, what Talmy is talking about here is what I've been talking about. So his spatial disposition connects sites and paths to the grounds which surround them. So, and a site is just a fiat spatial entity. A path is a fiat spatial entity. It's a certain kind of fiat spatial entity, namely one along which we can move. So it's a long extended fiat spatial entity where, for instance, the history of Poland is not quite so long. And that actually is not quite what I wanted to say. The history of Poland is not a path in Talmy's sense. We hope that it will be very, very long. It did have gaps already, but anyway. Every use of language is continuously creating fiat spatial and fiat spatial temporal entities. All right, now this is the final part. And so this is about the limits of artificial intelligence. And I will give you some background here. First of all, this is indebted to a lot of work by my collaborator in Germany, a man by the name of Josef Landgräber, who has for some years been the owner and principal engineer of an AI company called Cognitect, which is developing AI systems to deal with various kinds of language automatically. And the important thing here is that he is doing narrow AI. What that means is that he's dealing with language systems which always relate to a certain narrow domain, such as banking or insurance or car repair or medical prescription writing or real estate managing. So in each of those domains, you have a narrow kind of language system, and Landgräber is using AI successfully in order to create language, primarily written language, within one or other of those language systems. For instance, answering letters to the insurance company automatically, which is by no means trivial, but it's narrow. That's the important thing. Now, through all of this work, Landgräber has come to the conviction that general language systems or general AI as a whole is impossible. There will never be general AI. A lot of people in AI believe that, but there are very few people in AI who are willing to defend the thesis in public, which is what I am doing today and what Josef has been doing for some time. Now, the second preliminary is that Barbara is right that I have done a lot of work on ontology, including spatial ontology, the ontology of spatial fiat spatial entities in particular. And the goal of that work was indeed to create a logico-mathematical system which would allow a machine to reason about space and about space-time. And I still think the development of such systems, logical systems, for AI purposes is important, and that we will achieve a lot in that regard, whether by using some of the ideas on fiat spatial entities or not, that's another matter. But this will be narrow AI. We can have narrow AI for human language, and theories of spatial entities are going to help build such narrow AI. In fact, they are already helping to build such narrow AI. Why will we never have general AI? That's what I'm going to try and demonstrate next. And I'm focusing on spatial examples, but some of the examples are not spatial. They may be metaphorically spatial, but they're not spatial in the physical sense, which interests me. Now, the first thing which has to be said is that every conversation creates a spatial context. So when you are talking to someone in dialogue, there will be a place where you are located. It might be a police station, it might be a pub, whatever it is, it's going to determine the kind of dialogue which you engage in typically. Now, there'll always be untypical cases. That's important in what follows, but I won't repeatedly mention that at this point, Barbara could interrupt me and start singing rap music songs just because she feels like she wants to get in the way. That can always happen in every single conversation, and sometimes it does happen. Sometimes it happens in police stations. All right, that's important. And then we have the spatio-temporal context. The temporal context will be the time of day when it occurs, which may be dinner time, it may be during a talk like this, and so on. And now it's interesting that you don't always know what spatial context you're in. So there is a not very famous poem or lyric in the German literature, which is called "The Rider and Lake Constance." Now, I'm not going to read the poem. I'll just summarize the poem. It's very interesting. So there is a rider who, on a winter evening when there's heavy snow, arrives at an inn. So he's surrounded by wind-swept plains, and there's a blanket of snow everywhere. And the landlord comes to the door and asks him where he's coming from, and he points in the direction straight back away from the inn. And the landlord then, in a tone of awe and wonder, says, "Do you know that you just rode across Lake Constance?" At which the rider dropped, stone dead at his feet. So the rider did not know where he was. He did not know what the spatial context of his conversation with the landlord was. And as soon as he knew that, he killed himself, or anyway, died of shock. Now, there is also social context, which is metaphorically spatial, which has to do with your place in society. And this again determines the way you use language in the relevant context that you're in because of your position in society in that context. So you are accused criminal. You're going to speak to a judge in the dock in a different way than you will speak if you are the prosecuting attorney, for instance. And you're going to speak in a different way if you're speaking to a priest in confession, and so on. So where you are, both in space and in social space, will affect how you can behave and what you can say. And we've already mentioned deixis, but there is a very interesting kind of normative deixis which is involved where people are engaging with people around them, not necessarily in conversation, but in giving instructions. So when people tell each other to stop smoking or to wait here, that this can be with different degrees of normativity and in different tones of voice correspondingly. And then there is a very nice one at the bottom, which is, "Am I in the right room?" which is an example of somebody who is not quite sure which conversation they're in, or they're about to join, and they want to check whether they are joining the right conversation. Okay, now context also, including spatial context, but certainly including social context, dictates what you're allowed to talk about. And in England, if you meet a stranger, you're only allowed to talk about two things without being first introduced. One is the weather, and the other is if you're on a railway platform and the train is late, then you're allowed to complain to your neighbor. In other countries, you can talk about more things, but there are always restrictions on what you can talk about, except when there aren't. And there aren't restrictions in many kinds of conversations. So potentially you can talk about anything and everything. And this implies a huge amount of variance in conversational data. So I can even talk about Barbara singing hip hop songs as well as singing reggae songs in the middle of this talk, or about Barbara not singing those songs. I can talk about anything I want. Now, one thing I can talk about is this talk. So in other words, I can make my conversation with you all the topic of my conversation with you all. I can say I don't want to be involved in this conversation, or I can say that you probably don't want to be involved in this conversation. And all that means that all of the time I'm talking about what I'm talking about my talking about what I'm now talking about. And this too generates a huge problem of variance within the total data set of conversations. And then there's role-taking dynamics. So now I am the speaker. There will come a time when you are the speaker and when Barbara is the speaker. And there are dynamics which are governed by rules which are followed in a context like this, but which are not followed in most contexts. It is said that in the context of discussions between intellectuals in Paris, all conversations take the form of interruptions. So you never have a conversation which is not also an interruption. Now, typical conversations involve some interruptions. They involve new speakers joining the conversation, sometimes uninvited. So the rule-governed role-taking dynamics is the norm only in certain special cases like interviews or in the theater, perhaps. It's not the norm in ordinary conversation, and that again adds a whole new layer of dynamics, a variance. So there are pauses, there are hesitations, there are false starts, mistakes, interruptions, attempts by speakers to take over the conversation, attempts by outsiders to take over the conversation, violence, people shouting, and so on and so on. All of this adds to the variance. And then there's two-way causal interaction, turning on the fact that actually I can't see you, but in a normal conversation, I can see the people who I'm talking to, and I can react by adjusting what I say to the ways my interlocutors are behaving, whether in a friendly way or in an angry way, or whether they're walking out of the room. Maybe most of you did already walk out of the room, as one says. All right, now, what I say depends how you respond, not just in your body language, but also in the way you speak. And all of these things determine how the conversation continues dynamically. I think I've just said that. And so the limits of artificial intelligence, as I say, this is with thanks to Josef Landgräber. So this is a slide produced by him. What do I need to make deep learning possible? Well, you need a lot of training data. So think of a spam filter. In order to make a spam filter work, you need a lot of input-output tuples, where humans put certain emails into the spam box, and then you get tuples, many millions of tuples. You can use those tuples to train a spam filter because the tuples are representative of the way any other human being would assign an email or not assign an email to the spam box. And deep learning works because you can train a machine to replicate the variance captured in the training sample that you feed it, so that the deep learning machine can use the training data to classify spam reliably because it knows from what you've told it what is typically spam. But for this work to work, the training data must be reasonably consistent. So you can't train a machine to predict the oil price at any given time. It's impossible because the oil price is erratic data. It changes randomly. Finally, the data must be abundant. So, and what this means is it doesn't just need to be such that there is a lot of it. It needs to be representative of the variance across the inputs. Now, you can't have representative data across the variance created by general conversation. It's impossible. And he can prove that mathematically. And therefore, you can't have an AI machine which can engage in conversation in such a way that, as they say, the AI machine would pass the Turing test. You can't do it. And that's the end. And that's a summary of what I just said. And this is actually a technical version of what I just said. So conversational data is non-ergodic. So it's never distributed according to a predictable pattern, mathematically speaking. It's also evolutionary. What that means is that there are always new elements and new element types and new interactions and new interaction types arising. And that means that you can never have training data which would capture the variance in a predictable way. And therefore, and this is an explanation of why that is. How we achieve performance human convincing performance in conversation? And the answer is purely metaphorical. So we have no idea how we do this, but it has to do with flows of molecules in the brain. Maybe some of you in the audience have a better idea. But certainly the people who've attempted to engineer conversation machines are not resting their work on ideas that they've described from neuroscience. And so our capability of spontaneous understanding and responsive reproduction of language reveals the natural biological nature of especially spoken language. We cannot use deep learning to emulate this natural biological behavior. This is the conclusion. And this is the end.